The night was cold, the kind of cold that seeped through thin clothes and turned every breath into a painful cloud of air. Emma pulled her ragged coat tighter around herself, but it did little to fight off the biting wind. She had been walking for hours, her shoes worn thin, her stomach empty, her eyes scanning the streets for anything at all, that might keep her safe until morning. The city's alleys and benches had become her home for months now, but tonight, the cold felt sharper, heavier, as if the world itself was trying to push her out. She whispered a prayer, not for wealth or miracles, but simply for a corner where she could rest without fear. The streets were silent, the lamps casting long shadows on the ground, and each step echoed like a reminder of her loneliness. She stopped to rest against a stone wall, but when she lifted her head she saw it, a mansion tall and glowing with warm light, as though it belonged to another universe. Her heart pounded as she stood frozen on the pavement staring at the grand house. The gates were open, as though inviting her in, though she knew that wasn't the truth. Mansions like this weren't built for people like her. They were for the rich, the untouchable, those who had more food than they could eat in a lifetime and warmth they never had to fight for. But the light spilling from its windows pulled her closer. Maybe, she thought, maybe if she could just sit inside the entryway, she wouldn't freeze to death tonight. The thought scared her, but the cold hurt more. With trembling legs, she stepped through the gates, expecting someone to shout at her, but the night stayed silent. Her hands brushed against the iron as she walked forward, and with every step, her heart told her she was crossing a line she could never return from. Emma reached the front door, a massive wooden structure with carvings of vines and flowers. She hesitated, her breath quick and shallow, her fingers hovering above the polished brass handle. She wasn't a thief. She wasn't planning to steal. She only wanted to survive the night. But what if someone saw her? What if they called the police, or worse, threw her back into the streets with no second chance? She closed her eyes, whispering again, as though someone above might hear. Just a little warmth, that's all I ask. And then, with a courage born not from bravery but from desperation, she pushed the door open. To her shock, it creaked but did not resist. The door wasn't locked. A wave of warm air swept over her immediately, rich with the smell of roasted meat and fresh bread. Her legs nearly gave way. She stepped inside, her battered shoes sinking into a carpet so soft she thought she might be dreaming. The mansion's hall was enormous, stretching upward into a ceiling so high she couldn't see the details in the dim chandelier light. Marble floors gleamed beneath her feet, and portraits of serious-looking men and women lined the walls, their painted eyes seeming to watch her every move. She felt smaller than she ever had, like an intruder in a world too grand for her to exist in. Her instinct screamed at her to turn back, to run before someone found her, but the warmth held her captive. She closed the door gently behind her and stood in silence, waiting for footsteps or shouting, but none came. The house was so quiet, it seemed like time had paused. Her stomach growled loudly, echoing in the hall, and she clutched it in embarrassment, though no one was there to hear. The air was heavy with the smell of food, and she knew that somewhere in this house, a feast was waiting. She moved forward, her steps light, almost soundless on the marble. Each room she passed was more beautiful than the last. A drawing room with velvet chairs, a dining hall with a table long enough for 50 people, a library lined with books she longed to touch. She ran her fingers lightly along the spines of the nearest ones, tracing names of authors she had only ever heard in whispers. For a moment, she forgot her hunger, her cold, her fear. She imagined herself sitting in a chair with a book in her lap, reading by the fire as though she belonged here, but reality returned quickly, and with it the growl of her stomach. The scent of food drew her like a string, guiding her toward the kitchen. She hesitated at the doorway, her heart racing, but what she saw made her eyes widen. On a long counter lay trays of food, steaming and untouched, as though a banquet had been prepared for a celebration that never came. Roasted chicken, bowls of potatoes, baskets of bread, cakes frosted with cream. It was too much. Her throat tightened, and tears stung her eyes. Emma stepped inside, her hands shaking as she reached for a small roll of bread. She broke it in half and stuffed a piece into her mouth. The taste was so soft, so rich, she almost sobbed. She ate carefully, slowly, savoring each bite, as though the food might vanish if she didn't respect it. But then a sound behind her made her freeze. A low cough, deliberate, sharp. She spun around, her face pale, crumbs still in her hand. At the doorway stood a man, tall, broad-shouldered, dressed in a crisp shirt and dark trousers. His eyes were stern, and his presence filled the room like thunder. For a moment, neither spoke. Emma's lips parted, but no words came. The bread in her hand felt like evidence of a crime. She wanted to run, to disappear, but her legs wouldn't move. The man stepped forward, his gaze never leaving hers, and the silence between them stretched longer and heavier until finally, he spoke. His voice was deep, calm, but cold. "Who are you?" he asked. "And what are you doing in my house?" Emma's breath caught in her throat, and for a moment she couldn't speak. The words seemed trapped in her chest, clawing for release but tangled by fear. She clutched the piece of bread tighter in her hand as if it could shield her from the man's piercing gaze. His eyes narrowed slightly, not in anger, but in an intensity that made her feel like every secret she carried was suddenly exposed. She swallowed hard, forcing her voice to work. I'm sorry," she whispered, her voice trembling but clear enough to be heard in the vast kitchen. "I didn't mean to. I wasn't trying to steal, I was cold. And hungry." She dropped her gaze to the floor, shame flushing her cheeks. The silence that followed stretched painfully. She expected him to shout, to call for guards, or to throw her into the night without another word. Instead, she heard the sound of footsteps approaching. They were slow, measured, each one echoing against the tiled floor like the beat of a drum. When he finally stopped, he was standing close enough for her to see the faint lines of age around his eyes, the faint scar on his chin, the way his hands flexed at his sides as though holding back an emotion he hadn't decided to release. Emma dared a glance upward, just enough to catch his expression. It wasn't rage. Not quite. It was curiosity, and something else she couldn't name. "This is my home," he said, his voice still calm, but carrying a weight that pressed against her chest. "And people don't just walk into it. How did you get past the gates?" Emma opened her mouth, then closed it, realizing she didn't have a good answer. They were open," she said finally. "I thought maybe if I just sat inside for a while I wouldn't freeze tonight. I wasn't going to take anything more than this." She lifted the bread as if to prove her words, her eyes wide and pleading. "I swear it." The man studied her in silence, and Emma felt her heart hammering harder with each passing second. His gaze flicked to her clothes, threadbare, dirty, worn through at the knees. He looked at her shoes, barely holding together, and her hands, raw from the cold. For a moment his stern expression softened, though just slightly. Then he turned, walked to the counter, and without a word, picked up a knife and began cutting a slice of roasted chicken. Emma blinked, confused, uncertain if this was a trick or a test. He placed the meat on a plate, added some potatoes, and slid it across the counter toward her. "If you're going to eat," he said, his tone steady, "do it properly, not like a thief." The kindness of the gesture hit Emma like a wave. Her chest tightened, and she struggled to hold back tears. She stepped forward cautiously, her trembling hand reaching for the plate. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice breaking. He didn't reply, only leaned back against the counter with his arms crossed, watching her carefully as she sat down and began to eat. Every bite was a mixture of relief and guilt. She ate slowly, conscious of his eyes on her, but also unable to hide her hunger. When she finally set the fork down, her stomach warm and full for the first time in months, she lowered her head again. "I'll leave now," she said softly. "I've already taken more than I should." His voice stopped her. "You think walking back into the cold will solve your problems?" She looked up, startled by the sharpness of his tone. "You'll freeze by morning, or worse. You don't belong out there. But you don't belong in here either. Not yet. Emma didn't understand what he meant, but the words carried a strange weight, like a decision had already been made about her fate. Before she could ask, the sound of footsteps echoed from the hallway. A woman's voice, clear and commanding, cut through the silence. "Edward? Who are you talking to?" Emma froze, panic rushing through her veins. She stood up quickly, her chair scraping against the floor, her heart pounding as if she had been caught in the act of a great crime. A tall woman entered the kitchen, her gown elegant and her expression sharp. Her eyes fell instantly on Emma, and they narrowed with suspicion. "What is this?" she demanded, her voice cold as steel. Edward, the man, didn't flinch. He simply gestured toward Emma with one hand. "She came in from the cold. She was hungry. I gave her food." The woman's eyes widened in disbelief. "You let a stranger, a beggar, into our home? Do you realize what danger you could have brought us?" Her words were like knives, slicing through the fragile warmth Emma had just begun to feel. Emma's chest tightened, shame burning her face, but Edward's voice rose, steady and unyielding. "She's not a threat, Margaret. Look at her. She's just a girl who needed help." The woman, Margaret, crossed her arms and gave Emma a long, hard stare, as if trying to see beyond her ragged clothes into her very soul. Emma wanted to speak, to explain, but her throat felt too tight, her fear too heavy. Margaret finally spoke again, her tone laced with disdain. "She cannot stay here. What will people say if they find out? This house is not a shelter." Edward's jaw tightened, but he didn't answer right away. The silence between them grew heavy, and Emma felt like a burden, an intruder caught between two worlds. For a moment she thought Edward would agree and cast her out, but then his eyes shifted back to Emma, and she saw a flicker of something in them. Resolve, or perhaps defiance. He stepped forward, placing a hand on the counter as if to anchor his decision. "She will stay," he said firmly. Margaret's eyes widened in outrage. "Stay? Have you lost your mind? We know nothing about her. She could be lying. She could be dangerous." "She's a girl," Edward interrupted, his voice like stone. "Hungry, alone. If that makes her dangerous, then perhaps we're the ones who've lost our humanity." Emma's breath caught, her body trembling as the words sank in. He was defending her, standing up for her in a house that wasn't hers, against people who had every right to throw her out. She wanted to speak, to say thank you, but the lump in her throat held her silent. Margaret, furious, turned sharply and stormed out of the room, her footsteps echoing down the hall. The silence that followed was heavy, but Edward broke it with a sigh. "Come with me," he said quietly, motioning for Emma to follow. "There's something you need to see." Emma hesitated but obeyed, her heart pounding as she trailed behind him through the mansion's endless halls. The house seemed even larger now, each shadow whispering secrets she couldn't yet understand. Edward finally stopped at a door at the end of a long corridor. He unlocked it with a key from his pocket, and when the door swung open, Emma gasped. Inside was a room unlike any she had ever seen. A small sitting room, modest compared to the grandeur of the rest of the mansion, but warm and welcoming. A fireplace glowed with gentle flames casting golden light across the room. There was a soft bed in the corner, neatly made, and a window that overlooked the garden, its curtains tied back. Edward turned to her, his expression unreadable. "This will be your room, for now, until we figure out what comes next." Emma stood at the threshold of the room, her mouth slightly open, unable to believe what she was seeing. The bed looked softer than anything she had ever touched. The fire crackled with a warmth that felt like a dream, and the faint scent of lavender hung in the air. It didn't belong to her. None of it did. She gripped the doorframe tightly, almost afraid to step inside, as though the moment her foot touched the rug, someone would appear and drag her out. Edward's voice cut through her thoughts, low but steady. "Go on," he said. "It's meant to be used, not admired." She shook her head, still frozen. I don't. This isn't for me." Edward's eyes softened slightly, though his expression remained firm. "It is tonight. No arguments." Her legs moved almost against her will, and she stepped into the room. The warmth from the fire wrapped around her like a blanket, loosening the icy grip of the night still clinging to her bones. She walked to the bed and touched the coverlet, her fingers sinking into the thick fabric. The sensation nearly undid her. For so long, every surface she had laid on was hard, cold, unforgiving. This felt like kindness made solid. She blinked rapidly, trying to keep the tears from spilling, but one slid down her cheek anyway. She turned away quickly, embarrassed, but Edward had already seen. He didn't comment, only said, "Rest. You're safe here." He placed the key to the room on the small table by the bed and added quietly, "Lock the door if it makes you feel better. No one will bother you." With that, he turned and left, closing the door gently behind him. Emma sat on the edge of the bed, the mattress dipping under her weight, and for a long while she didn't move. Her thoughts spun faster than she could catch them. Who was this man, really? Why would someone like him, wealthy, powerful, living in a mansion that could swallow her entire world, show kindness to someone like her? She pressed her palms together, whispering softly to herself, as though testing if the words made sense. He wants me to stay. He gave me food. He gave me a bed. She couldn't remember the last time anyone had given her anything without expecting something in return. That thought alone both comforted and terrified her. Finally, exhaustion overcame her doubts. She lay down, pulled the covers over her body, and sank into a sleep so deep and heavy it felt like falling into another world. But the mansion was not as silent as it seemed. Downstairs in the grand sitting room, Margaret's voice rose in sharp tones. "This is madness, Edward. You cannot simply take in strays off the street. Do you realize the scandal if the neighbors hear? They'll think we've lost control, that we've turned this house into a refuge for beggars." Edward poured himself a glass of brandy, his movements slow, deliberate. He didn't look at her as he answered, "Let them think what they want. I won't throw her into the snow to die." Margaret scoffed, pacing the room, her heels clicking against the polished floor. "You're being sentimental. You don't even know her name, her past, what she's capable of. She could be lying about everything." Edward finally turned to face her, his expression hard. "And what if she's not? What if she's just a girl with no one left? Would you rather her corpse be found in the street tomorrow? Is that what you'd prefer, Margaret?" The question silenced her, though her lips pressed into a thin line. She hated being challenged, hated the way Edward's words struck too close to her pride. "This will not end well," she said coldly. "Mark my words. Taking her in will only bring trouble." With that, she swept out of the room, her presence lingering like a bitter perfume. Edward took a long sip of his drink, his thoughts dark and restless. He had acted on instinct, yes, but there was more to it than that. Something in the girl's eyes had struck him, a mixture of fear and strength, of weariness and defiance. She wasn't ordinary, not to him. And though he couldn't explain it, he knew this night was the beginning of something that would change the balance of the house forever. Morning came softly, sunlight creeping through the curtains of the little room upstairs. Emma stirred, the warmth of the bed shocking her as she opened her eyes. For a moment, she forgot where she was. She expected to see the damp stone walls of an alley, the rough surface of a blanket beneath her, the sharp smell of the streets. Instead, she found herself in comfort, wrapped in clean sheets, the fire now only embers. She sat up slowly, blinking against the light, and reality rushed back. The mansion, the food, Edward, Margaret's cold glare. It hadn't been a dream. She touched the coverlet again, half to reassure herself it was real. A knock sounded at the door, making her jump. Her heart pounded as she stood and approached. She unlocked it cautiously, pulling it open just a crack. A maid stood there, her uniform crisp, her hair pulled back neatly. She was younger than Emma, perhaps 17, her eyes curious but not unkind. "Mr. Sterling asked me to bring you some breakfast," the girl said, holding out a tray. Emma hesitated, then took it carefully, her hands trembling slightly. The maid glanced into the room, taking in Emma's plain clothes and nervous posture. She offered a small, almost secret smile. "You're lucky," she whispered. "Most people who walk in here don't get treated this kindly." Before Emma could reply, the maid turned and hurried away, leaving her alone again. Emma set the tray on the small table and looked down at the food: eggs, toast, fruit, even a cup of tea. Her stomach tightened with gratitude, but her mind was unsettled. Why was Edward doing this for her? What did he see in her that made him take such a risk? As she ate, she tried to form a plan. She couldn't stay here forever. This was their world, not hers. Sooner or later, Margaret would force Edward to send her away, and she needed to be ready. But the thought of leaving so soon made her chest ache. For the first time in years, she felt safe. For the first time, she wasn't invisible. And that was the most dangerous feeling of all. Emma nibbled at the toast slowly, trying to stretch the meal out as if making it last longer would buy her more time in the mansion. Every bite filled her with warmth, and for a few blissful moments, she allowed herself to forget the uncertainty waiting outside this room. But as the tray emptied, reality pushed itself back into her thoughts. She needed to decide whether to slip out quietly and spare herself the humiliation of being thrown out, or remain and risk Margaret's wrath. Her body ached for rest, and her heart whispered for her to stay. Yet her mind reminded her of how dangerous comfort could be. She had learned on the streets that kindness was often a trap. And still, Edward's steady voice echoed in her head. "Rest. You're safe here." It was the first time anyone had said those words to her in years. She wanted to believe them so badly, but fear tugged at the edges of her resolve. She had just set the tray aside when the door opened without a knock. Emma jumped, nearly knocking the cup of tea over. Margaret stood in the doorway, her frame tall and severe, dressed in a gown of deep blue silk that shimmered faintly in the morning light. Her eyes were cold and sharp, like blades hidden behind a thin smile. "So," she said, her tone thick with disdain, "our guest is awake." Emma rose quickly to her feet, clasping her hands in front of her. "Good morning, ma'am," she whispered, her voice trembling. Margaret stepped inside, closing the door behind her with a deliberate click. She circled the room slowly, her gaze sweeping over the bed, the fire, the untouched details that screamed of privilege. "Do you know how many women would give their lives to stand where you are now?" she asked. Emma shook her head, uncertain how to answer. Margaret stopped in front of her, tilting her chin up with a single finger. "And yet here you are, a street girl who doesn't belong, pretending this is yours." Emma's lips parted, but no words came out. Her throat felt dry, her chest tight. Margaret's smile didn't reach her eyes. "Let me give you some advice," she said softly. "Gratitude will not save you here. This house eats people alive, even those born to it. If you think Edward's kindness is a shield, you are mistaken. You will not last long." She let go of Emma's chin and turned toward the door. Just before leaving, she added, "The sooner you understand that, the less painful it will be." And then she was gone, her perfume lingering like smoke. Emma sank onto the bed, her knees weak. Every word had been a threat disguised as advice, and Emma knew she would need more than gratitude to survive here. Later that day, Edward found her in the garden. She had wandered there after Margaret's visit, needing air, needing space to think. The garden stretched wide, lined with marble statues and trimmed hedges, the fountain in the center spilling water that sparkled in the sun. Emma had never seen such beauty outside the pages of books she had read long ago, back when she still believed in happy endings. Edward approached quietly, his footsteps muffled by the gravel path. "You're already exploring," he said with a faint smile. Emma turned, startled, but tried to steady herself. "I didn't mean to intrude. The door was open." He shook his head. "It's not intrusion if I welcome you." His words carried a calmness that unsettled her, because they felt genuine, and she had forgotten how to trust genuine kindness. He studied her for a moment, his eyes thoughtful. "Margaret spoke to you, didn't she?" Emma lowered her gaze, unsure whether to admit it. Silence was answer enough. Edward sighed, running a hand through his dark hair. She means well in her own way, he said, though his tone betrayed the lie. But she sees the world through rules and reputation. Don't let her words poison you. Emma wanted to ask why he was helping her, why he cared at all, but fear held her tongue. Instead, she said softly, I'm grateful, sir, for everything, but I won't stay long. I know I don't belong here. Edward's expression hardened. That's for me to decide, not her. You needed shelter, and I gave it. There's no shame in accepting what's freely offered. He looked at her more intently now, as if trying to read the secrets behind her guarded eyes. But I'll ask you this, Emma. What is it you're running from? The question pierced her, sharper than Margaret's threats. She opened her mouth, then closed it again. The words caught in her throat. To admit the truth would mean unraveling everything she had fought to bury. Her past was heavy, filled with pain she wasn't ready to share. She managed a quiet reply. Just life. Edward didn't press further. Instead, he nodded slowly, as though he understood. Then let life rest for a while. Here, at least, you can breathe. He turned to walk with her along the garden path, his presence steady beside her, but Emma's mind spun with unease. Kindness was dangerous, she reminded herself again. Yet every step beside him made her want to believe he meant it. As the afternoon sun dipped lower, casting long shadows across the lawn, Emma realized this mansion was no ordinary place of refuge. It was a battlefield of power and pride, and she had walked straight into its center. Margaret was right about one thing. This house would test her. But Emma, though fragile and worn, was not as weak as she appeared. For the first time, she felt a strange flicker of determination rise within her. If the mansion wanted to consume her, it would find her far harder to swallow than anyone expected. That evening, Emma was summoned to dinner. The maid who had brought her breakfast earlier reappeared at the door, her face carefully neutral, though her eyes flickered with curiosity. Mr. Sterling asks that you join him in the dining room, she said politely. Emma's stomach nodded at once. She had eaten breakfast alone, quietly, with no one watching her every move. But dinner in a grand dining room meant Margaret would be there. Emma's instinct was to refuse, to find an excuse to stay hidden in her little room. But she knew such a refusal would only fuel Margaret's anger. She nodded instead, smoothing down her plain dress with trembling hands. Thank you, she whispered, following the maid through the long corridors lit with soft lamps. Each step echoed as though announcing her unworthiness, the mansion reminding her she did not belong. When they entered the dining room, Emma froze. The table stretched endlessly, polished wood gleaming under the crystal chandelier. Silver dishes and crystal glasses were set with precision, the cutlery lined up like soldiers in perfect rows. Margaret sat at the far end, her posture sharp and regal, her expression unreadable. Edward was beside her, though not close enough to suggest harmony between them. Two other family members Emma hadn't yet met were present, an older man with a stern jawline, who looked at her as though she were a stain on the tablecloth, and a young woman not much older than Emma, who eyed her with curiosity laced with amusement. Emma lowered her gaze and whispered, "Good evening." Edward stood and pulled a chair closer to him. "Come, sit here," he said firmly, leaving no room for debate. Emma moved forward cautiously, aware of Margaret's eyes burning into her every step. She sat, folding her hands neatly in her lap, and tried to breathe without trembling. Dinner began in heavy silence, broken only by the soft clinking of cutlery against fine china. The older man, Edward's uncle, she later learned, finally spoke, his voice carrying judgment with every syllable. "So this is the girl," he said, "the stray you've taken in." Emma's face burned, but before she could reply, Edward's voice cut across the table. "Her name is Emma." His tone carried a warning, but the uncle only scoffed. Names don't change where one comes from, nor what one is. Margaret's lips curved in a cold smile. "We are not unkind, Edward. We simply wish to protect what's ours. Bringing in outsiders invites gossip." and gossip becomes scandal. She sipped her wine, her eyes never leaving Emma. The younger woman, whom Emma soon realized was Edward's cousin Clara, leaned forward slightly, her tone lighter. Don't be cruel. She looks harmless enough. Besides, isn't it rather exciting? A poor girl seated at our table, like something out of a novel. Her laughter rang sharp, though not entirely malicious, and Emma wasn't sure whether Clara was mocking her or defending her. Either way, the eyes around the table pressed on her like a weight, and Emma wished desperately she could vanish. Edward's patience wore thin. She is my guest, he said firmly, and she will be treated as such. The room quieted for a moment, the authority in his voice silencing even Margaret. But silence did not erase the hostility in the air. It only buried it, waiting to rise later. Emma ate little, her appetite ruined by the tension, though the food was the finest she had ever seen. She forced down a few bites of roasted lamb, some vegetables, and sipped water from a crystal glass, each swallow feeling like a test. Every movement, every gesture was measured against the judgmental stares of those around her. When the meal finally ended, Emma excused herself softly, her voice nearly lost in the cavernous room. She slipped away, her heart pounding, retreating back to the safety of her chamber. But even there, she could not escape the feeling that she had just stepped into a game she didn't understand. Margaret's words from earlier returned to her. Gratitude will not save you here. Emma now understood them better. It wasn't just about gratitude. It was about survival. The mansion was not merely a house, but a stage, and every person within it played a role with rules she didn't know. If she stayed, she would have to learn quickly. Otherwise, she would be crushed. As Emma sat by the window staring out at the moonlit garden, she felt torn between fear and determination. Fear whispered that Margaret was right, that she would be swallowed whole by the family's contempt. But determination sparked faintly, reminding her she had survived the streets, hunger, and loneliness. She was not as fragile as they thought. If the mansion was a battlefield, she would fight quietly, patiently, in ways they would not expect. For the first time, Emma wondered if she could carve a place for herself here, not because she was welcomed, but because she refused to be erased. The next morning, Emma woke to a knock at her door. She opened it to find Clara, Edward's cousin, standing there with a mischievous smile. Clara carried a bundle of dresses draped over her arm, fabrics so fine they seemed to shimmer in the soft morning light. Come, Clara said in a tone that was both inviting and commanding. We're going to make you presentable. Emma blinked, unsure if this was kindness or mockery. Clara swept into the room without waiting for permission, laying the dresses across the bed. You can't possibly walk around in those rags. If you're to be seen in this house, you'll need proper attire. Emma's cheeks burned. These are beautiful, she whispered, fingers grazing the silks and lace. But before she could say more, Clara leaned in, her voice lowered conspiratorially. Don't mistake this for generosity. Margaret ordered me to do this. She wants you to look respectable. But don't be fooled. It's a test. Every dress, every stitch, is meant to remind you that you don't belong in them. Her smile faltered for a moment, replaced by something unreadable. Still, wear them. Better you look like one of us than give her more reason to sneer. Clara helped Emma dress, selecting a pale blue gown that hugged her figure and made her look, to her own astonishment, like someone she had never imagined being. When Emma caught sight of herself in the tall mirror, her breath caught. She almost didn't recognize the girl staring back, no longer the ragged figure who had walked through the mansion's gates, but someone polished, delicate, almost elegant. For a fleeting moment, hope flickered in her chest. Maybe, just maybe, she could adapt, but the hope shattered quickly. At breakfast, Margaret's eyes swept over Emma in the gown and narrowed. Clara, you've outdone yourself, she said dryly. How clever. You've managed to make her look almost human. The words, delivered with an icy smile, cut sharper than a blade. The older uncle chuckled under his breath, clearly amused. Edward, however, slammed his fork down against the plate. Enough, he said sharply. She is not your amusement. His gaze met Emma's, and though his expression was angry, the anger was not at her but for her. That alone steadied her heart. After breakfast, Emma retreated to the gardens, seeking solace among the roses and ivy climbing the stone walls. It was quiet there, the air rich with the scent of dew and earth, and for a short while she could almost forget the cold cruelty inside. But even in the garden, peace did not last. Margaret appeared, her steps soft on the gravel path, her presence commanding the air around her. She stood before Emma, eyes narrowed, hands folded neatly before her. "Do not mistake Edward's kindness for protection," she said calmly, almost gently, which made the words all the more frightening. "This house has swallowed stronger women than you. You will not last." Emma's throat tightened, but she forced herself to meet Margaret's gaze. "I never asked for any of this," she said softly. "I didn't come here to take anything." Margaret's lips curved into a cruel smile. "And yet, here you are, in his house, in our clothes, eating at our table. You may not have asked, but you've taken all the same, and we will not let it stand." With that, she turned and walked away, leaving Emma trembling in the garden, her heart pounding with both fear and defiance. As the days passed, the subtle cruelties multiplied. A maid accidentally spilled hot tea on Emma's lap. A footman whispered insults as she passed. At dinner, Margaret would ask Emma complex questions about literature or politics, only to smirk when Emma faltered, reminding everyone of her lack of education. Clara's laughter echoed in the background, not always cruel, but never protective either. It was clear to Emma, the family was circling, testing her limits, waiting for the moment she would finally break. Yet Emma did not break. Each humiliation stung, but she endured it quietly, her resilience hidden beneath lowered eyes and polite answers. What none of them realized was that her years on the street had prepared her for this kind of cruelty. She had faced hunger, cold and loneliness that none of them could imagine. A cutting remark or spilled tea could not undo her. But Margaret had not played her final card yet. She was planning something bigger, something devastating, a cruel plan that would make Emma's quiet endurance meaningless if she could not outwit it. One evening, the family gathered in the grand hall under the pretense of a celebration. Margaret had insisted on hosting a dinner to formally welcome Emma into the household, and though Edward was suspicious, he agreed, hoping it would ease the tensions. Emma dressed carefully, choosing a modest gown, her nerves tight as she stepped into the glittering room. The chandeliers glowed, the table was set with crystal and silver, and every seat was occupied by a relative whose eyes carried judgment. At first the evening was polite. Toasts were made, wine was poured, and small talk filled the space. But beneath the polished surface, Emma sensed something coiled, waiting to strike. It came when Margaret, her smile flawless and cruel, rose from her chair and clinked her glass for silence. "Ladies and gentlemen," she said, her voice smooth as silk, "tonight we celebrate a union that has shocked us all. But before we go further, I feel it is my duty to protect this family's name." She turned, and with a flick of her hand, a servant entered carrying a folded paper. "You see, our dear Emma has not been entirely honest." Gasps echoed as the servant handed Margaret the document. She unfolded it with deliberate slowness and read aloud. "Emma Grace Turner, arrested at age 16 for theft. Known associate of vagrants. Expelled from her last position for suspicion of dishonesty." Murmurs rippled around the table, faces turning toward Emma, their eyes wide with disdain. The paper was slammed onto the table, and Margaret's eyes gleamed with triumph. "This is the girl you brought into our home, Edward. A thief. A liar. Do you really believe she belongs here?" For a moment, silence crushed the room. Emma felt her blood run cold, her throat tightening as every pair of eyes burned into her. But then, she straightened her shoulders, the same way she had when Mrs. Higgins docked her pay for the broken vase. Her voice, though soft, cut through the tension. "Yes, I was arrested when I was 16. I stole a loaf of bread. My mother was sick and starving, and I had no one else to turn to. That is my great crime." She looked around the table, her gaze steady. "I have never hidden from the truth of my life. I have worked, I have struggled, and I have survived. Can any of you say the same?" The room froze. The weight of her words hung in the air. Edward rose, his chair scraping back. His voice thundered with fury. "Enough of this charade. I know exactly what this is. Your petty attempt to humiliate her, to destroy her, because you cannot bear the thought of a woman with more courage and dignity than any of you sitting at this table." He seized the paper from Margaret's hand, tore it in two, and let the pieces fall. "I love her. That is all that matters. If any of you cannot accept that, then leave this house tonight." No one moved. Margaret's face hardened, her mask cracking for the first time. But Edward's resolve was unshakable. He turned to Emma, his hand warm as he clasped hers. "You are my wife, my partner, and my equal, and I will stand by you until my last breath." Emma felt tears sting her eyes, but they were not of shame. They were of fierce, unyielding pride. For the first time, she was not a maid or a beggar or a shadow in someone else's home. She was herself, fully seen, and no scheme, no cruelty, could take that away. The family never spoke of that night again, though the silence was not acceptance but defeat. Margaret retreated into icy distance, her influence broken, her cruel plan undone. Emma, though never entirely welcomed, walked the halls of the mansion with her head high, her spirit unbroken. And in Edward's unwavering love she found not rescue but recognition, a place where she belonged, not because of wealth or name, but because she had fought for it and won.